Hello and welcome to Trade, a Cry for Help. Now, the purpose of this session is to understand from an exporter, from a government and from a trade finance perspective, where the issues are in terms of economic and geopolitical fallout from the COVID pandemic. Fairly obviously, we've seen some big issues over the last year. A year ago, we were talking about whether or not trade could survive. It has survived, but we're beginning to see big issues around supply chains suffering. There's a huge impact, particularly on UK exporters, of a drop in the number of shipments, not just from Europe, but actually from all the way around the world. But that's something that we're beginning to see in our data for absolutely everybody. Why is supply chain suffering as they are? Is it just because containers have ended up in the wrong place, or is there something bigger at play? For example, China's internal and external circulation, more focus on its internal markets and less focus on external policies. Is it to do with the drop in semiconductors and what's causing all of that? Is it because we're shifting our supply chains around and starting to think more about reducing dependency on one supplier? Or are there just bigger technological changes that are happening that mean that the way in which we trade is going to change and is changing forever? No, nothing like starting an afternoon with a huge bunch of questions, but in order to help me unpick some of those, I have a fantastic panel. So Andy Burwell is the International Director for the Confederation of British Industry. Diane Coyle is Professor of Public Policy at Cambridge University and also writes for the Financial Times. And Anand Menon is Director of UK and a Changing Europe at King's College, and is also a very high-profile public figure in debates about Brexit and the UK and Europe. Welcome to you all. And can I just say how privileged I am to have you on this panel. So, Diane, you're our economist. What's going on at the moment? What is the current economic situation that trade is a part of, and how is this actually manifesting itself? Is it because technology is changing and we're actually going through a huge technological change, which is changing everything that we do, or is it something that's just relatively short term and the consequences of the pandemic?
Well, there's another big question, so thanks very much for that, Rebecca, and thank you for the invitation to take part today. What's interesting is we've had an extraordinary economic shock with the COVID pandemic and the disruption that's caused in economies around the world and consequently trade. And this has come on top of 40 years, really, of digital technologies rewiring production in the world economy so that supply chains have been extended, there's been more specialization, both among firms and between countries. And so on this system, we've imposed a big shock. And in a way, it's a sort of production version of the financial crisis was for the financial system. And one of the interesting things reading the news in recent months has been just the sheer range of bottlenecks we didn't know anything about, illustrating the way these supply chains have been extended. So whether it's a fertilizer factory producing as a byproduct the CO2 that's needed to package food in the UK, or whether it's the big plastic bags that it turns out you need to make vaccines in, these bottlenecks really have been emerging. And one of the realizations is that actually it isn't just a few bottlenecks, it's everywhere, and the shock has just hit in these particular places, and it's why we're seeing these. And so the debate now is about moving from the just-in-time economy that we have created to a just-in-case economy. Do we need to, the buzzword is resilience, do we need to introduce more resilience or redundancy into supply chains? And the engineers are coming along and saying to the economists, well, we were never as stupid as you, we always build things that got redundancy in them anyway. And for the UK, Brexit has made it worse, but I'm going to leave that to Anand to talk about because he knows so much more about it. So we've had these 40 years of integration with a focus on, if you like, cost efficiency or logistical efficiency, and we're now paying the price for that. So on the one hand, the digital technologies have created extraordinary efficiencies, the availability of cheaper imports, more specialized and efficient production. And a great illustration of that has actually been the creation of the COVID vaccines, where rather than scientists having to package up and mail biological samples around the world, all of that genomic information about the virus has been done online. They've sent each other emails and the genetic code digitally. So there are good things about that. But on the other hand, there are bad things about it as well, and the lack of resilience, but also ranging into cybersecurity and cyber war is the other. And at the moment, and I'd love to hear what other people have got to say about this, I'm not sure whether this is going to go in a good direction or a bad direction, because it doesn't seem like the supply shortages are stabilizing in any way. If anything, they seem to be getting less stable and exacerbating each other. And when you read what the causes are, actually people cite lots of potential causes. It's overdetermined, which to me is a sign of a genuinely complex system where there are so many interactions among different parts of it and feedbacks that it's actually really difficult to tell where it's going to go. And unlike financial services, where central banks had a whole background about being a lender of the last resort and putting liquidity into the system, I don't think we've got the equivalent in this domain of production. And so I'm not sure whether I am going to get my turkey for Christmas or not. And maybe I'll pause there and let others pick up.
Oh wow, the thought of not getting a turkey for Christmas. But I mean, I think there's a very worrying thing there that you're highlighting, which is that we're going through this process of change and we don't really know which way it's going to go. And some of it is driven by changing patterns of behavior, and some of it is driven by problems that have been there for a very long time and systems unraveling. Andy, what is it that your members are seeing? Is there something that aligns with what Diane has just said that's coming through from your members? Are they seeing sort of problems that have been common for a long period of time, or ones that are relatively new and very specific?
Well, it's kind of a mixture, really. And firstly, thanks for having me today, and great to be supporting. So yeah, I think there's kind of a short-term, long-term piece here, which we have to kind of remain kind of conscious of. You know, I think the two areas which I would say are particularly an issue at the moment are obviously logistics, and you know we'll come on to that, I'm sure, in more detail throughout this session. But you know, the reasons behind the shipping issues at the moment. You know, one member said to me recently that actually it takes as long to fly something from A to B across the world now as actually to ship it. You know, it's across the whole logistics supply chain as a huge challenge the world is facing. Labour is obviously the second one, well known in the UK, and you know actually that again is hitting around the world, and that's obviously a COVID challenge in particular, as mobility has reduced. But I think there are broader challenges, and obviously Brexit being one for the UK in particular. I think more widely than that, in terms of the question that Diane set, in terms of where this is going, what's going to happen in the future. There was an interesting parallel which I was thinking about while you were speaking, which was about actually what's happening in Glasgow right now around COP26, around climate change. What's really that challenge to decarbonise trade, decarbonise supply chains? What is that going to need? That's going to need data. That's going to need a real understanding of actually the true depth of your supply chains, where they are, what's the carbon footprint. That could be hugely beneficial in actually identifying where some of these bottlenecks are. Because I think Diane's right, the big challenge at the moment is there's just a lot of unknowns. And that's not just unknowns in terms of where supply chains throughout this kind of just-in-time period have created bottlenecks, but equally, you know, what the factors are and the variable factors that are affecting the strength and resilience of those supply chains. So I think actually there's the first question in my mind is, how do we better understand, now we are more aware of it, what the challenges are. I don't think any business really understands the full depth of their supply chains at this point, particularly if they're a global corporate. But I think they are going through this process, driven by the last year or so, but equally because of kind of climate requirements as well.
Interesting. Do you see that as well, Anand? Do you see something that just a huge degree of uncertainty there? Or, I mean, what's happening is this huge change that we're going through is a huge structural change in the economic base of the global economy. It's not just the UK economy. It's the UK in a situation where it's very unique. Is this something that, because of Brexit, can we separate out the effects of Brexit and the effects of the pandemic? Is there anything that you can see from there?
I mean, several questions there. I mean, the first thing is there's an additional layer of uncertainty when it comes to the United Kingdom, and it's uncertainty that is compounded by what's going on both over the Northern Ireland Protocol, which affects businesses in Northern Ireland particularly, and over the future of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Businesses must, quite frankly, be fed up of hearing politicians talk about the need for certainty, which they've done ever since the referendum of 2016 and utterly failed to provide it. By every time it looks like there's a degree of certainty, politicians cast that into doubt by sort of casting doubt on current arrangements. And today, of course, you'll know there's all sorts of talk about the EU side trying to suspend elements of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. I imagine that this will all have an ongoing impact in terms of investment decisions. That complete lack of certainty makes it harder to take medium or long-term decisions about the UK economy. Can we tell what is Brexit, what is COVID, what is something else? Only with real difficulty. I mean, I'll defer to Diane here on the economic methodology, but it does seem to me that there are three separate things going on. And if you look at the case of hauliers, truck drivers, for instance, you can see quite clearly that the three sort of interact in very complicated ways. I mean, firstly, there are policy decisions independent of COVID and of Brexit that have partly landed us in this situation. So in the 4 years up to 2019, 15% of UK hauliers left the industry, or HGV drivers. That figure for France was only 5%. So there was an absence of planning and an absence of good public policy in terms of anticipating things that was more apparent here than it was in some of our European friends. Then, of course, there's COVID. COVID has a couple of impacts on the sector. Firstly, by disrupting supply chains generally. Secondly, with the backlog at DVLA that we all know about, that meant that there were fewer people getting tests and test results through, which further compounded the problem. And then there's Brexit, and Brexit has had an impact in the sense that we know for a fact that an awful lot of EU citizens returned home at the time of the pandemic, and not many of them are showing much in the way of signs of wanting to come back. And there are lots of reasons for that. I mean, partly it's a sort of psychological sense that they're less welcome here than they were before. Partly too, it's a real economic thing, isn't it? Which is, you know, the pound has devalued against the euro sharply since the referendum of 2016. And if people are thinking in terms of remittances, coming to the UK is perhaps not the obvious choice when there are France and Germany available as well that doesn't have the same problems with currency. So it's a very, very messy picture. But I think it would be naive in the extreme to claim that Brexit isn't part of the problem we're facing, because it most certainly is.
I can just chip in on the back of that. Sorry, Rebecca. Some years ago, I was a member of the UK government's Migration Advisory Committee. And part of the thinking, which was obviously right, was that a tighter migration regime would encourage employers to train up people who are already resident in the UK to do certain jobs and increase their skills. And one of the striking things about what's happened post-Brexit is that none of that clearly happened, because we were left with the labour shortages as a result of people from the rest of Europe leaving post-Brexit. And so the idea that the shortages that we have now will somehow quickly or without much effort fill in these skill gaps, I think is for the birds. That's not going to happen. So if you're an economist like me, it's a great petri dish to find out what happens when you do take away a resource that employers really need. And I know that in areas like agriculture here in the east of England, they're looking as quickly as ever they can at can they automate the strawberry picking and so on. But it's it's a long-standing public policy failure in terms of essentially old-fashioned workforce planning to the extent that it can be done.
Just on that point about Migration Advisory Committee, I was actually at the British Bankers Association, as was during time when they were consulting on some of the labour market issues. And what was what was being said at the time was a heavy reliance on that financial services have on call centres, but that a lot of the labour within call centres in the UK is actually migrant labour as well. A lot of the work that goes on in cleaning and sort of catering and logistics around business and financial services is also migrant labour, and I guess the corollary of that is, we can't turn the clock back, and we can't make the decision about the public policy decision again. But how do we learn from all of that? What does UK PLC have to do in order to be able to start to compete in this world where actually it's Britain alone, to coin Philip Stevens' book? It's by itself. Andy, do your members feel as though there is something there that they need to do and that they can do that's distinctive, or are they actually finding the trade environment very difficult because they don't have the certainty, as Anand says, that they had maybe 2-3 years ago? Was globalisation just a nice cozy word that meant that we were all safe and secure, and now we're all fighting in this sort of deconstructive world that's a lot more challenging?
I think it slightly depends on the nature of the business as well. So, if you are a business which is a multinational corporate, you benefited from everything that exporting global trade has to offer, then of course you're probably in a better position to take a step back now and think about actually how do you handle some of these crises and kind of move resources around. If you're an SME, and actually globalization, you haven't seen the benefit of it, maybe all of your business is within our domestic shores, or your first step was into Europe, as for the vast majority of SMEs it was, and it probably still will be, then I think these challenges will persist for longer, and actually your perception of whether globalization has been a success or not is going to be in question. I think the longer term piece of kind of actually do they think that there is still kind of benefit in terms of globalization? Is it something which has had its day and moving past it? I don't think so. I think there is definitely a challenge in rhetoric now for the government. We're awaiting the refreshed export strategy, which is due out very soon. I think obviously everything that Anand was talking about, the stuff around the Northern Ireland Protocol, again, extremely sensitive, extremely important at the moment, because that is not just in that individual circumstance very important, but also a bellwether for how the broader TCA and that relationship going forward with Europe could pan out. So I think there is a perception piece that the government needs to handle with business to truly support the benefits of free trade, the benefits of exporting, to ensure that as an economy we are successful. Because I think the benefits of globalization are still there. Companies who export are still more productive. They're still more innovative. They still are more resilient, as we've seen through COVID. I think your data, Rebecca, has shown that quite clearly. Actually, businesses who export and are international and seek the benefits that globalization can bring, actually deal with the shocks better. But I think they're going to have to do it in a more pragmatic way, and data will inevitably be the kind of starting point behind that.
So, Anand.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of things on the back of that. I mean, firstly, we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking it's just here in the UK whether there are issues over trade or trade policy. I mean, if you look across the Western world, there's a nasty whiff of mercantilism and protectionism in the air. I mean, we see that over the Atlantic, but we also see it in some of the rhetoric from the European Union about the economic implications of so-called strategic autonomy, which some people in France are talking about as technological sovereignty, which bodes ill, I think, for free trade going forward. But I mean, of all the sort of economic data we've seen recently, the piece that really concerns me about the United Kingdom is the continued slump in exports, including exports to the rest of the world outside the European Union. I mean, one of the justifications of Brexit was it would allow us to focus more attention and more energy on our trading relationships outside Europe. And our export performance over the course of the last 6 months has been pretty dire, to be honest. And there are real questions to be asked about what's happening there and what's going on. The final thing I'd say is, and I think this is a bit overlooked in the debate, the government keeps talking about this high wage, high productivity economy. And of course, most economists would say that one of the best ways to have a negative impact on productivity is to make yourself less open to trade, particularly less open to trade to your largest trading partner, is that there are productivity impacts from your openness to trade. And the combination of what the TCA is doing and will continue to do to our trade with the EU and rather sclerotic trade with the rest of the world is, it appears that the UK economy is somewhat less open to trade than it was previously, and that is going to have spillover effects on the domestic economy.
Diane, there's a huge amount for you to unpick there in terms of the economic position that we find ourselves in, the UK individually. Is it an open economy? My understanding was we're not as open as Germany, but we're a pretty open economy. We're very heavily reliant on imports, and surely the big elephant in the room globally at the moment with all of this is not just the fact that we've got supply chain shortages. It's the fact that, as you said right at the beginning, this is actually pushing prices up, and it's pushing prices up in a way that's in the real economy, not the monetary economy. And so it's creating all sorts of challenges for central bankers, isn't it?
So globalization has been a really good thing for reasons of productivity and exports and low prices, either for imported inputs or for consumer goods. There has been some rethinking in economics, though, about how much globalization you want in all sectors of the economy. And the reason is that actually producing things creates know-how that enables the research and development and future innovation. And this is one of the things that's being reflected in the European debate at the moment and about the chip shortages. Europe has now got to the stage where to produce a company like TSMC producing chips is nigh on impossible. And it's that sort of capability that you lose by relying entirely on globalized production chains. And I think it's fair to say that there's been a bit of rethinking in economics about that. Having said that, I completely agree with Anand that, that if we get into this mercantilist competitive trap in what ought to be a positive sum trade game, we're really in a bad place, and it is very concerning. One question I have about the slump in exports recently in the UK is to what extent that's to do with data capture, and maybe you know more about this than I do, Rebecca. I just don't know if that's an as accurate a reflection of exports as the prior data sets were pre-Brexit, and I just don't know the answer to that. But it does, on the face of it, look really concerning.
So, I mean, I guess that's a question to me, so I'm going to abuse my position as chair, but I think in answering it, but I think as well, it's a broader question. So what we are seeing, and this is happening with global trade, not just UK trade, is that we're not capturing the trade that is unmeasurable. So we're not capturing as much of service sector trade as we should be. We're not capturing financial services trade. We're not quite clear exactly what's happened with those cross-border trade flows. What is interesting, though, is if you look at the breakdown just very crudely between goods and services trade over the last 20 months, which is a function of the pandemic and potentially Brexit as well, what we have seen is a drop in services trade. So we've seen commodity trade, i.e. goods trade, fall off a cliff, but we've seen services trade suffer as well. Again, it's happened all the way around the world because people have been less able to travel, and that type of trade is not measured well anyway. For example, I mean, I provide data services to clients all the way around the world. In my providing data services, am I exporting? Am I importing? It comes across actually as just an international payment in my bank account, and it's actually a bank account. Because there aren't rules and regulations against services in the same way that there are tariffs and taxonomies, including in sustainability around goods trade. It means that the services sector is unmeasured to a very large extent, and it means that digital trade is not measured. Now that takes me to a huge next set of questions, because if we aren't measuring that type of trade, then what is the role of the World Trade Organization and supranational organizations like that as we start to move to, you're absolutely right, a more sort of nationalistic type of trade policy, or certainly regionalistic type of trade policy? What is the role of organizations like the World Trade Organization in monitoring change and making those changes sustainable as we move more towards trade that can't be measured? Digital printing, all of these types of things which are beginning to alter the way in which we run our supply chains. How is that going? What is the role of the WTO? Andy, you must work with the WTO. Tell us.
I was wondering who else would be coming to. It's like one of the biggest questions. I think
they're all big.
The WTO in particular. So I went to the public forum recently, and the CBI chaired the business side of the G7 earlier this year, all of which really shone a light on the significant amount of reform that's needed at the WTO. And I think everybody on this call was probably aware of that. First and foremost, how can you have a multilateral organization without a body to arbitrate and enforce laws? Super hard. The US need to think about their position on that. But there is a broader question in WTO, which is whether the multilateral approach with the nationalist agendas, with some of the new economic models, which are growing in certain parts of the world, whether actually it's a productive way of formalizing kind of policy. I think the success of the joint initiatives, JSIs, at the WTO, that's basically where smaller groups of countries come together and agree a set of rules, then implement them in their own countries, hoping therefore to stimulate trade, stimulate investment, which then encourages other countries to sign up, had made some progress, and we should see some of that at MC12, the ministerial meeting at WTO, coming up soon. And I think that has kind of been replicated when you look at regional trade globally. If you look at the RCEP, the CPTPP, the classic acronyms which everyone hates to pronounce, all of those effectively are for kind of bodies to not just open up trade, but actually to develop new trade policy. If you look at CPTPP in particular, it's pretty much the foremost policy area for digital. I bet my bottom dollar it will be for climate and sustainability trade as well. There are areas outside of WTO which are now developing and really furthering trade policy globally. And I think that's, if I'm honest, probably the future. I think the WTO still has a role as that collective voice, but realistically, it takes too long to agree anything when you're trying to do so with over 200 countries.
And that goes back to the point you were making about open strategic autonomy, though, doesn't it? If the WTO is becoming less important as an appeals procedure, is important in terms of sort of broad general rules-based order. But if CPTPP is actually becoming more important in terms of digital trade and technology, then does open strategic autonomy actually mean anything? What's the relationship between Europe and this whole sort of shift in trade policy? Is Europe going to become a regulatory superpower, particularly in the area of sustainability? And does that alter the way in which we do trade deals?
I mean, Europe already is a regulatory superpower, I would say, and that doesn't hinge on anything like strategic autonomy. You could almost argue quite the contrary. But the fact of the matter is the sheer size of the European market means that the things it does have enormous bearing all over the rest of the world, including, as we've seen from case studies in places like California, where EU standards tend to be adopted. And that's a problem for the United Kingdom, is that having a regulatory superpower on your doorstep is, whether we like it or not, going to have an immense impact on our ability to make the most of our newfound independence. If you look at things like the carbon border adjustment tax debate going on in the European Union, that has massive implications for us, whether we like it or not. And, this idea that we can sort of leave the European Union and move on is a charming idea, but an utterly naive one, because, you know, if you look at policy debates that happen in Mexico or in Canada or in any of China's neighbours, whether you like it or not, if you're next to a continental-sized economy, what happens in that continental-sized economy is going to have an enormous bearing on everything you do, simply because of scale. So whether or not the European Union ever develops the political clout to match its regulatory heft, which is essentially what the debate about strategic autonomy is about, that's an open question. I tend to be rather suspicious. You know, I tend to think that the more times European policymakers say strategic autonomy, the less likely they are to actually achieve it. But that doesn't, in any sense, negate the fact that in regulatory and economic terms, the European Union is already there, even if sometimes it doesn't quite know what to do with that influence it wields.
So
there's an important point here about the different words in the kind of open strategic autonomy. I think if they can focus more on the open bit, and less on the strategic bit. I think actually that's a form of nationalist competition, which actually, you know, might be beneficial. I think the UK, in a way, will have to work out where it's going to be competitive in the long term, where it's going to have that strategic autonomy and really drive forward our own industries in a collaborative, open way. And the open bit is the really important part in those three words.
Diane, you were going to come in.
I was just going to reflect how interesting it is that different arenas of regulation are starting to converge with each other. Trade, intellectual property, telecommunications, and this is happening within countries, but also at the international level. And, you know, I think all of these regulators are finding it quite hard to grapple with. And trade and competition policy would be another example, with the big tech companies being American and the big state-owned enterprises being Chinese. And what do we think about inward investment in the domain of competition? It's just all sort of up in the air at the moment. And I think a lot of regulators are struggling to know how to coordinate across their different legal responsibilities.
Is it because the world has suddenly got really, well, to coin a phrase, global? Is it because as we've taken away our structures of globalization and started to become more nationalistic and more concerned actually about our domestic pressures, we've started to realize that we have all of these sort of feelers out into various international domains, and that we have this degree of strategic dependency on other countries, and I mean strategic in a national security sense of the word, through our economies. Does that actually mean that we've made everything so complicated that we can't measure it anymore? Is that actually part of the problem, that we can't make things simple enough for businesses and policymakers and regulators to understand what's happening?
Well, as you were saying, we're not measuring enough, and that's something that governments ought to be addressing. Statistics, the word comes from state. Statistics are the information that states use to govern, and they're really important, although people think it's incredibly nerdy. And so that's part of the issue. I think it's also the dematerialization that you were talking about earlier, Rebecca, but also the fact that things had been going swimmingly for quite a long time, and now we've had two major crises, and that's created the need to think about whether we've got the right policies in place across the board.
I think I'd add to that, and sorry, I really am abusing my position as chair here, but I think I'd add to that and say, in measurement terms, this almost feels like the beginning, and I know this is one of your themes, Diane, so I won't bore on the subject, but I'll let you share your thoughts, because you know so much more about it than I do. But it feels like it's the Kuznets moment. It feels like it's the moment where you start measuring something new. You have to because what we have been measuring is actually a misdirection. We've been looking at incomes, and we've been looking at relative incomes, and we've been looking at how we produce income in an economy, and it's not about income anymore. And the big shift that we're seeing in trade, and the big shift that we're seeing in the whole economic base, is actually to start measuring sustainability now. I mean, we've had conversations this morning in the sessions this morning, which have all been about how we measure aspects of supply chains, how we value chains in terms of where they are sustainable. That's a whole new energy and a whole new value creating system. It's not the economics of happiness anymore. It's actually the economics of sustainability, and it's all normative. So how do we go about doing it?
Well, I could bore for hours on this, and I won't take the opportunity to do so. I think of it as how do we conceptualize progress in this world that we have created, facing the global challenges that we do, and given all of the changes that have taken place in the past 40 or 50 years. And I don't think there's a good answer to that. And so the statistical questions and the conceptual questions, if you like, are related to each other. So luckily this will keep me going for the rest of my career, because it is what I research, but maybe not the time to go into more of it now.
I mean, it's probably just worth saying that, I mean, I agree absolutely that we need to think about what we're measuring and what we're trying to achieve, but let's not lose from sight that even when it comes to the really sort of boring old-fashioned stuff, the data we have seems sort of not quite as good as we want. If you look at the sort of persistent gap between ONS and Eurostat figures when it comes to UK-EU trade, there's something strange going on even with the traditional data that it would be nice to get to the bottom of at some point.
We have people talking about how important data is to business. Data is important across the board, and it needs much more resource putting into it in the public sector.
So there's on that, there's a question that's come in. So it reads, the Monetary Authority of Singapore has helped set up a Metahub called Proxterra to assist its SMEs in reaching a bigger cross-border ecosystem of financiers, buyers, sellers, logistic firms, etc. Trades on the platform are end-to-end and traceable from order through to payment. If we're talking about data and we're talking about measurement, should the UK do something similar, or should it join hubs like that? So Andy, maybe we can take this into your commercial domain and say, let's count, is this something that the UK government ought to be doing, encouraging international platforms? Or Diane and Anand, is that just a different form of globalization? And who owns our data?
Well, I'll let Diane maybe focus on the last point about data, who owns it. But I think the point of how to support, in particular, SMEs to export, how to help them identify deals. Obviously, digital solutions are important, and I'm not going to say we should support one or another because there's a whole plethora of them out there, and industry by industry as well. I don't think the good old ways of getting on a plane are quite over, and I think that will still be important. But we've seen during COVID that deals still can be done digitally. The government has been doing kind of digital roadshows, which have actually proven to be pretty popular. And there is that kind of classic way of finding buyers, finding sellers, kind of doing trade, I suppose, for SMEs. But digital solutions, will only increase. We've already seen it with the Export Support Service and a few of the other bits and bobs that the British government will likely announce with the export strategy. And I think there will inevitably be that question off the back of that, of who owns our data. There's an important kind of link here as well to the broader kind of digital policy and data policy questions of data localization, ensuring that free flow of data with trust, which will be probably the most important trade policy for the next, or for the foreseeable future, full stop, and how we digitize the full kind of trade process will be fundamentally important. Well, I'll hand over to Anne to talk about who's going to own the digital trade data going forward.
Well, it shouldn't be owned. It's a public good. And there's obviously a trade-off between privacy or commercial confidentiality on the one hand and the public good you get from access to and joining up data on the other. So I think we need a much more granular policy debate about where to be on that trade-off and how to implement it. I do think for many countries, data localization is actually a mistake, because the big tech companies that, quotes, own the data, they need to be in every economy to be able to make use of the data in ways that are economically profitable. So focusing on data localization as opposed to behaviors and where is the profit and where does tax get paid is the wrong place to be thinking about. But there are also huge technical issues, of course. As anybody who's ever had to merge two databases with different software and different records will know. So it's easy to talk about taking advantage of all this wonderful new data out there. It's actually jolly hard work to do in practice, as Rebecca knows better than anybody.
Somewhat. I guess my question from all of this, though, is this issue about data and the UK building its own platforms or working with other platforms and data crossing borders. It's an absolutely huge issue. It's one of the big themes that's still outstanding in terms of our relationship with the European Union still. Where is equivalence? What type of structures do we need to have? Who owns the data that the individual shares with their bank or their financial institution? All of these are very, very, very big questions. And ultimately, they're geopolitical ones too, which we'll come on to in a minute. But Anand, what are the big challenges in terms of data sharing as you see it? And is this something that's affecting exporters and the financial services sector?
Well, I'm sensing myself to be out of my depth here. I'm very happy to leave most of these questions to the other two. But what I would say is, as ever, for the UK, there are some difficult trade-offs here, because if we want to create sort of data sharing arrangements with other countries around the world, and there's a lot of talk, we've touched on this here about CTP, you say, Andy, and
I always give it time
within it. We have this equivalence decision from the European Union, which is fundamental for a lot of traders, but that is going to be permanently up for review. It's going to be permanently up for review as a function, A, of what we do in the digital space with other countries. And it's also going to be permanently up for review as a function of the political relationship between us and the European Union, because the European Union isn't beyond pulling some of these levers for political reasons, if not for economic ones. So there's always that trade-off to be aware of, that we can be as creative as we like in terms of building data regimes with other countries, but there might be a price to pay closer to home, because the EU reserves the right to pull that adequacy decision at 30 days notice.
Andy, how does that affect your members, or doesn't it?
Well, it's honestly, this is the big question. If I was going to say anything right now in terms of our relationship with the EU, and I'm sure we'll have a commentary on this, we just need to move past the politics and really get moving on basically collaborating. The CHIPS Act being a really good example of this. The US have their CHIPS Act. The EU's recently announced they're going to develop the strategic autonomy on developing the next and the future in chips technology and semiconductor technology. That's great. It needs to be done in a collaborative way with the UK, and it needs to be done on a European basis rather than the EU and UK going in the separate directions and never working across the border. So really, that's the big one. It's not about we're off making deals with CPTPP and developing new digital policy with a new set of countries, and obviously looking over our shoulder at the EU. That's not the way we should be handling our relationships or doing trade, both politically or from a business perspective. And we need to move and focus on collaboration with our allies as we develop our competitive advantages going forward.
So I guess my question then would be, in terms of how we are building those data relationships, you have to see this in terms of a strategic decision. You have to see this in terms of where the UK is going in terms of its future relationships. Is it with Europe? Is it with America? Is it in the Indo-Pacific? Can we build all of these data relationships with China or without China? And given the role of the US, are we likely more and more to exclude China from our data decisions? And does that therefore have a consequence for what we're doing in the whole sustainability space? Because the problem at the moment is that we need global standards. We need to go back to the point to measure properly in order to be able to create a uniform way of going about the sustainability problem that we all face, a sustainability elephant in the room, if you like. So how do we get to that point where we're able to pivot our strategy so that we're working with the right people, but we're not excluding China? And I think that is the flip side of open strategic autonomy. Yes, we talk about it in terms of technology, but it's also about things like who owns data and where our strategic power is militarily as well. So there's an independence element to the open strategic autonomy debate. So what do we do? Do we exclude China on military grounds and strategic grounds, or do we include them on sustainability and data grounds?
I'm not going to answer the question, but I will observe that given where we are geopolitically with China and the US, as you say, focusing on technical compatibility seems to me to be really important because it leaves options open in future. And the parallel I have in mind is the impact of the GSM standard on the mobile phone market, and the fact that that did become a global standard enabled that market to grow to scale. The scale economies meant the equipment and the handsets became cheaper, and we saw the transformative effect that that technology has had on many low-income countries as well as developed economies. So I think, at a minimum, struggling to have common technical standards wherever the politics takes us is really important.
Anand, is that feasible?
Well, I think when it comes to the case of China, there are, again, very, very difficult trade-offs here, and it's going to hinge a lot on the politics. I mean, I get a sense already that the government's been dragged slightly further than some who inhabit Downing Street would want us to have gone when it comes to China. And the backbench pressure on China policy is massively unpredictable. You get the impression at the moment that the issue has slightly lost some of the salience that it had, say, a year ago. But, you know, this is where political leaders need to lead and not follow, is they need to sort of set down some parameters and, if necessary, take on recalcitrant backbenchers, because you're absolutely right. You can't ignore China. You can object to some of the things that China is doing, but you can't simply just pretend they're not there and not work with them, particularly given the sustainability agenda. And that's a question for our political leaders to figure out. And if necessary, as I said, to impose a bit of discipline on backbenchers who I think too often are in favour of symbolic initiatives, irrespective of the longer term economic impact of those.
Andy, can we balance economic and sustainability interests with China? Can we do it?
That is the big question.
I know.
We need to. You know, it's fundamentally we need to. And I completely agree with what Anand was just saying. It's a challenge which the government needs to front up on. And I think probably the US in particular, but other countries around the world, are more effective at having a proper conversation about you know, how we stand up for our values and challenge where we need to challenge. And there are some difficult challenges, as we all know, with China, whilst also collaborating where we need to collaborate and competing where we need to compete. And they're the kind of three buckets in my mind. It's challenge, collaborate, and compete. I think the collaboration piece will take time, but I think you know, China is open to it. Probably less so now than it was a couple of years ago, but I think it's a cyclical kind of challenge with China, and I think they will come back to the table more and more, you know, as the years progress. And yeah, completely agree with Diane. I think the standards of the future, the rules of the future, particularly around kind of digital technology and data, is really going to drive future growth. And the UK to lead in that space, I think, is, you know, should be a foundation of our economic and foreign policy. I think the integrated review, when that was published earlier this year, highlighted that. It also highlighted a ton of technologies that the UK is going to kind of develop a competitive advantage in, all of which relied on digital and data. So we're never going to escape this question. I do think we need a better balance in the public narrative. We're not the US, you know, and we need to understand that. We cannot stand up and say whatever we want without there being probably a little bit of backlash, as Australia has found. We do have kind of unique advantages of our economy, such as our financial services industry in the City of London, which actually China wants to work with and collaborate with, and that is a weapon in our arsenal. But we also just need to be a little bit more pragmatic and sensible about how we position ourselves. It's a delicate balance and a hard one to find, but yeah, we need to do it.
I think one of the
we're
things...
mid-tier power. How do we go about positioning ourselves? Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think one of the things that isn't mentioned enough is one of the implications of being outside the European Union is it makes us more vulnerable to Chinese retaliation. That is to say, they don't have to retaliate against 28 states with a massive continental-sized economy. If they want to retaliate against the United Kingdom, they can now do so without including the rest of the European Union. And so we possibly have to tread a little bit more carefully than if we enjoyed the sort of cushioning effect of membership.
Does it matter that they didn't come to COP26? Question coming through here.
Well, I suppose that we're all waiting to see what's going to emerge from COP26 anyway, and how decisive that will be. We've all got to make an energy transition. China's got a bigger energy transition than most to make. It is not possible, not feasible to say they should not enjoy economic growth. And they also have the structure of relationships between the centre and the provinces, which make it difficult. So I don't think it's going to make a big difference to the world that they weren't actually at the meeting, but it'll make a huge difference to the world how they go about that energy transition and how quickly.
So
the way that China normally operates as well, we should just kind of recognise that they tend to under promise and over deliver. They like to be seen within that light, and it wouldn't surprise me, even though they've set a 2016 deadline, that 2060 deadline, sorry, that actually they will invest and really push the technologies and development of their industries to drive to be a renewable superpower and clean energy. So I don't think necessarily that it's a huge issue, China not being at COP. I think optically it was a poor decision, but I do think I agree with Diane that the pressure will be there for them domestically as well as internationally, and they will respond.
Cool. I'm going to ask each of you, because this is to a large extent the big challenging question for strategy, or whoever's strategy, business strategy, research strategy, energy strategy, and obviously economic strategy as well. What are we going to be talking about in a year's time? So we've got this big sustainability push coming through. We've got big geopolitical issues, and we haven't really talked about the shift in Biden's policy, whether he's still a multilateralist or whether actually he's showing himself to be fairly domestic in his focus. There are a lot of issues that are still unraveling as a result of the pandemic. So I'd ask each of you in turn just to say a couple of minutes on what you think the big patterns are for the next year and what we're going to be talking about in 12 months' time. Diane, shall I start with you?
Oh gosh, I suppose I think it could go in two possibly opposite directions, depending on how things turn out. We could be in a world where there are still supply shortages, there's stagflation, there's economic hardship because of the debt overhang from the pandemic and all those small businesses finally going under or having their loans called in. So we could be in that kind of bad place and be playing the blame game and how much is it to do with Brexit and whose fault is it and so on. Or we could alternatively be in a world where, because of the shocks we've experienced and because of the change in attitudes generationally, people are starting to focus on that narrative, that positive vision of what progress will be like and what kind of country we want to be, and even perhaps debating some of these issues that we've been talking about today. And that seems a question of politics and that effective political leadership that Anand was talking about. And I'm not going to claim a crystal ball when it comes to that.
Anand.
I mean, I think one of the things we are going to be talking about in a year's time is how America First Joe Biden has proven to be, despite the rhetoric about multilateralism. But I'm sorry, I mean, this is a really rubbish answer to give you. I think in this country, we're going to be talking about Brexit in a year's time.
Good.
Just because politically, it strikes me that there's no easy way out of the impasse we're in over the Northern Ireland Protocol. I suspect the British government is going to use Article 16. I suspect that is going to trigger both arbitration and potential retaliation from the European Union. And it's hard sometimes to avoid the sense that Brexit is being used to avoid some of those more sober, rational, long-term discussions that, as Diane said, we really ought to be having at the moment.
Well, Brexit pessimist, or maybe the likes of us are all still going to be in jobs this time next year because we're still talking about Brexit. Andy.
I'm shocked that Anand's answer was Brexit. For me, it's a whole array of things. US November midterms. Looking what's just happened. Biden, could be a dead duck president second half of his term if that goes completely wrong. And what happens then to his commitments around sustainability, etc. So getting the spending approved now is really important. Completely agree with Anand. Unfortunately, I think what happens over the coming months with Article 16, with Northern Ireland Protocol, will define what we're talking about in relation to Europe and Brexit. I think two other things, probably climate sustainability. We just got to COP26, but there's a whole phase now of implementing actually all the discussions that they're having at COP. And I think business will step up to that. I think there is that wall of capital out there, and we've our members are talking about it from a UK investment point of view, and we've been kind of discussing this with the UK government around the Global Investment Summit, how the UK needs to be able to investing itself, because everyone else is this competitive advantage and competitive environment for that. So I still think sustainability and climate will be at the fore of everyone's lips. And from a domestic UK perspective, I agree with Dan. Let's hope it's not speculation. But I think inflation, where interest rates are going, where the supply chain challenges are, this isn't going to be ironed out quickly. Recovery is going to take a while. How do you make that recovery sustainable? How do you make it inclusive outside of UK borders? How do you do it in a collaborative way? There's lots of questions.
Lots of questions, more questions than answers. Well, I'm really looking forward to next year's conversation then, because there's a hell of a lot there to be getting on with. I think you're probably right, Anand, as well. I think we will still be talking about Brexit. I hope we're starting to look at measuring in a more constructive way the issues of data, which we've raised here, which are incredibly important for the world. I think we need to come to some kind of agreement around how we create common standards around data sharing and sustainability. And actually, I think they're bigger questions now than the geopolitics of all of this, because I think the risk that we face at the moment is the fact that the private sector is moving faster than policy is, and technology is moving faster than policy is. And so let's hope that in a year's time, we're actually talking about the fact that this has happened in a positive way rather than a negative way. Diane and Andy, thank you so much for your insights. As always, absolutely fantastic, really brilliant conversation. And thank you very much indeed, and see you again next year. Take care.
Rebecca.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.